Let me say, first of all, the last 3 days of hearings have revealed very good news. They have revealed the news that Judge Barrett is going to be confirmed by this committee and by the full Senate. With 2 full days of questioning, we've seen that our Democratic colleagues have very few questions actually to raise about Judge Barrett's qualifications. Very little of the time we've spent in here has concerned her record as a judge, her 20 years as a respected scholar. Instead, much of this hearing has focused on political attacks directed at President Trump. I recognize our Democratic colleagues are not going to be voting for President Trump in November. That's certainly their prerogative. But they've largely abandoned even trying to make the case that Judge Barrett is anything other than exceptionally well qualified to serve as a justice. It is striking that as we sit here right now in this committee room, there are only 2 Democratic senators in the room. If you look at the dais, there's chair after chair after chair that is empty. The Democratic senators are no longer even attending. I assume they'll show up for their time. But it is indicative of what they're tacitly admitting, which is that they don't have substantive criticisms.
Mr. Chairman, may I make a point of personal privilege?
Of course.
We're in the midst of a COVID-19 crisis, a pandemic, and some members are in their offices following this on television, and to suggest their absence here means they're not following or participating is incorrect.
I would note the senator from Illinois, in his personal privilege, somehow omitted the fact that all but 2 of the Democrats were physically here yesterday, and after the questioning, they made the decision not to be here. That's fine. You're welcome to make that decision, but it's indicative when it comes to the time of the questioning that this side of the aisle does not have arguments against Judge Barrett that have any chance of prevailing. I do want to address a couple of the individual points that have been made. So many of the Democratic senators have talked about Obamacare at great length. At times I have been confused, and I thought we were on the Health Committee instead of the Judiciary Committee, because it has been such a central talking point for every Democrat that if President Trump is reelected, they assert everyone with pre-existing conditions is going to be denied health care, and people will be dying in the streets. And I get that's their reelection message. It's not actually connected to reality. It's not actually true. Every member of the Senate agrees we're going to protect pre-existing conditions, and I would note that not a one of the Democratic senators who raised that point have addressed the very real and catastrophic failures under Obamacare. Obamacare has doubled the profits of the big health insurance companies, doubled them. Obamacare has been great corporate welfare for giant health insurance companies. At the same time, according to the Kaiser Foundation, average families' premiums have risen $7,967 per year on average. That is catastrophic that millions of Americans can't afford health care. It is a catastrophic failure of Obamacare. And none of that has anything to do with Judge Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court. That is a very good argument for members of the Senate to be having. And yes, we should be protecting pre-existing conditions and expanding competition, expanding options, and lowering premiums. This body will continue to debate that, but Judge Barrett will not be the decision maker on what the appropriate approach to health care is as a policy matter. A second point I want to address, Senator Durbin had an exchange with Judge Barrett about the right to vote and also about the Second Amendment. Now, as a policy matter, many Senate Democrats, number one, want to see the Second Amendment abridged to the maximum extent possible. And number two, many Senate Democrats have decided as a policy matter that they would like to see as many felons as possible able to vote. That it is, one would presume, they have made a determination it's in their political interest to have more felons, more convicted murderers, more convicted rapists, more people convicted of domestic abuse voting, that they've made an assessment that that helps their prospects on Election Day. They're entitled to make that policy determination, and different states have made different determinations about in what circumstances felons should be allowed to vote, in what circumstances felons should not be allowed to vote. I, for one, am a bit puzzled. I'm not sure our democracy is better by changing the law to allow murderers to vote. I'm not sure the operation of the republic would be better if Charles Manson had a greater voice in the electoral system. And I would note one of our colleagues, Senator Sanders from Vermont, in the course of the Democratic presidential primaries, argued not just felons who are out of jail, he argued that felons in jail, literally Charles Manson, serving a life sentence, or I think multiple life sentences for murder, should be able to vote. It's a policy matter. I think that's pretty out there. But the interesting thing is, Judge Barrett wasn't called upon to make a determination whether as a policy matter every felon should vote or no felon should vote or somewhere in between. Rather, she was doing a very different thing, which is applying the law. And Judge Barrett, did I hear you correctly that when you were describing your dissent in the counter case, that one of the reasons you said that there was a difference in the law as it concerned voting versus the Second Amendment is because the 14th Amendment, the text of the 14th Amendment explicitly contemplates legislatures making restrictions on voting based on whether you've committed a crime? Is that right?
That's right.
And I actually have the text of the amendment because Senator Durbin was highly critical. As a policy matter, he wants those felons voting. But he didn't, in fact, address the legal issue that as a judge, Judge Barrett was obliged to address. And Section 2 of the 14th Amendment provides in relevant part, but when the right to vote at any election is denied or is in any way abridged, except for participation in rebellion or other crime. Well, Senator Durbin may not like that the 14th Amendment explicitly contemplates that if you commit a crime, if you're a felon, you may forfeit your right to vote, but that is in the text of the Constitution. And as a judge, Judge Barrett would be not doing her job were she not to look at the text of the Constitution and follow the text of the Constitution. Am I right, Judge Barrett, that the Second Amendment doesn't have similar language suggesting or other crime or anything comparable to that?
You are correct.
You know, most of us have multiple notebooks and notes and books and things like that in front of us. Can you hold up what you've been referring to in answering our questions? Is there anything on it?
That letterhead that says United States Senate.
That's impressive. Well, Judge, the best I can understand, the objections to your nomination are not to your qualifications, your experience, or training, but it's that you have or you will violate your oath of office. I find that terribly insulting. They suggest that you can't be unbiased in deciding a case you haven't even participated in yet. I find that insulting as well. You know, maybe almost as pernicious as attacking somebody for their faith and suggesting that that disqualifies them from holding a public office is the attack that's being made on judicial independence, something that Chief Justice Rehnquist, among others, observed the crown jewels of the American Constitution and the American system. But I want to just take a little walk down memory lane here. You know, there are a lot of people who guessed how judges would actually rule on cases, and almost always they've been spectacularly wrong. I was struck by just a couple. Harry Truman said, whenever you put a man, and that he's talking about a man, but a man or woman on the Supreme Court, he ceases to be your friend. He said some more colorful things, too. But Theodore Roosevelt said about Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., he said, I could carve out of a banana a judge with more backbone than that. And as I think about people like Harry Blackmun, nominated by Richard Nixon, who wrote Roe versus Wade. As I think about Warren Burger, you know, they were called the Minnesota Twins, and obviously over time they became sort of polar opposites on the court. I think about the attacks on Neil Gorsuch for his unwillingness to make a prior commitment on LGBT issues. He wrote the Bostock case extending Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to gay or transgender individuals. Obviously, those predictions were wrong. And then, since we're talking about the ACA, it's the ACA versus ACB, I guess. Chief Justice Roberts was the one who wrote the opinion upholding the Affordable Care Act, as you know. So I would just say that all of these predictions about how judges under our independent judiciary will make decisions are just pure speculation. But I think they're worse than speculation. I think they're propaganda in order to try to make a political point. So, Judge, you're not willing to make a deal.
No, Senator Cornyn, I'm not willing to make a deal, not with the committee, not with the president, not with anyone. I'm independent.
I just would like to hear maybe some of your thoughts on, in the Obergefell case, which established, as you said, a constitutional right to same-sex marriage, part of that decision struck down the Defense of Marriage Act, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
That was a bill that Joe Biden voted for?
I don't know
Well,
about that.
I do.
Okay.
Joe Biden voted for it, Pat Leahy, and Bill Clinton signed it into law. Can you just, I'm not asking you to get into the details, but just sort of differentiate for everybody listening what the approach of a legislator is in voting for a piece of legislation as opposed to the role of a judge in interpreting the constitutionality of a piece of legislation? Are they the same or are they different?
They're quite different. A judge isn't expressing a policy view. You know, I tell my students in constitutional law that newspapers do courts a disservice when, you know, they say things like, you know, court favors same-sex marriage, or, you know, just giving the headline without showing any of the reasoning that goes into it. Because courts are not just expressing a policy preference. They're digging in. They're looking at the precedent, they're looking at the Constitution, and even when the result cuts against policy preferences, judges are obliged to follow them. I suspect that this body doesn't cast votes that conflict with their policy preferences.